Welcome to RetinUp. I'm Scott Kriswanis.
And I'm John Kitchens.
John, before we get into the Vitreoretinal View segment, which we'll be using at the front part of our episode, I want to talk about what Donald Trump said about some national finances.
Medicaid, Medicare, all these individual things, they can do it on a state basis. You can't do it on a federal. We have to take care of one thing, military protection. We have to guard the country. But all these little things, all these little scams that have taken place, you have to let states take care of them.
Is this some scuttlebutt that you and your colleagues are concerned about?
It hasn't really hit home yet, Scott, but it certainly does resonate. Anytime you hear a politician, much less the president, talking about cuts to Medicare, which is the major payer that we deal with in retina, or Medicaid, which certainly helps our diabetic patients and our underserved patients, your ears kind of pop up and you go, okay, wait a second, what's really going to happen here? So I think it's definitely a concern. And when you look at how much money they might have to be able to reallocate through a reconciliation of the budget, $200 billion is going to have to come from somewhere. And that would cause a major hardship for our elderly patients. It certainly would have a big effect on managed Medicare. I think we'd see a lot more insurance companies with tiered therapy and Avastin first policies are really kind of ratcheting down on what drugs we could use. So I don't see any way in which this can be a good thing for our patients.
Yeah, I wonder if this is a serious thought or if this is a half-baked idea. I mean, I imagine any kind of cut to Medicare would be really, really unpopular, but I guess you never know. To your point, the money has to come from somewhere. Has there been anything like this in the past that you can recall during your career? Has there been a time where Congress has clawed back funding for Medicare or Medicaid, and it's actually made a difference in retina practice?
Not really. There's always this concept of there being a cut every year. Usually it's like 3 or 4%, and they always get staved off by a last minute, kind of stay of execution from the Congress. But it hasn't really happened. I agree with you. I think it'd be incredibly unpopular, and with midterms approaching, it could be pretty devastating. Maybe it's a threat to get people to actually do it through a true budgetary process, but yeah, I don't see any way that this doesn't impact our patients and our practices if it does indeed happen.
If it does indeed happen. So you mentioned you think that it might lead to some tiered therapy or some Avastin first policies. Where are some other spots where you think Medicare and Medicaid would try to save money in order to, get to whatever the desired number is?
Yeah, I think for Medicaid patients, it's going to be access to care. They might increase the cost of Medicaid. You might see insurers dropping out of Medicaid. You might see hospital systems, particularly universities, would be particularly vulnerable. They do make a little bit more from Medicaid patients, and that helps facilitate those patients who have access to care issues. But mainly, I think the biggest cost savings are going to be on the drug side, and I think we'll see something happen if this does happen from first managed Medicare and then eventually potentially even Medicare itself, traditional Medicare, that would be very, very impactful. We deal with this all the time, though. There's all these threats of a demonstration project or something that might change as far as the way they, bill and reimburse services or drugs, and it never seems to come to fruition. So hopefully we'll maintain some sort of status quo. It's a broken system. It needs to be fixed, but it needs to be fixed really at its core and not through kind of shortchanging it to try and budget for military actions elsewhere.
Before we get to our next segment, educate me and anyone in our audience who may not know the difference between Medicare and managed Medicare.
Yeah, so it's a great question. And I didn't know much about that until I started doing practice. Traditional Medicare, which is about half of all of the Medicare insured patients. Obviously, Medicare and managed Medicare is for our older patients over 65. The traditional Medicare is where the government actually is going to pay for 80% of your healthcare costs. You're going to be responsible for 20%. We're talking about Medicare Part B, which means you're going to pay for 20% of your office visit. You're going to pay for 20% of your drugs. Good days oftentimes helps kick in and pay for the additional 20% if you can't cover that for the drug side of things. Managed Medicare, which covers the other 50% of patients that are on Medicare, is where they've taken that same money or some of those same monies and they've allocated them to insurance companies who have said, hey, we think we can do it better by managing these patients' care. They will then allocate a certain amount of money for the patient. They'll have to make a profit from it. So they're going to actually do it for usually less costs than what Medicare would achieve the same amount of care for. But they do it through tiered therapies. They limit the use to the second generation or the branded products. So there's Avastin first policies. They make you get prior authorizations more thoroughly, benefits investigations and whatnot. So there's kind of this middleman who's an insurance company in there kind of dictating what you can and can't do. Patients still have copays, sometimes not as much as the 20%, but they entice patients because they'll say, hey, listen, we're going to give you free vision insurance, or we're going to give you additional dental insurance, or we're going to provide additional coverage if you go the managed Medicare route versus the traditional Medicare route.
And managed Medicare, this is Medicare Advantage, right? That's the other term that's used sometimes?
Medicare Advantage, yeah, and it's usually run by companies like United Healthcare, Humana, these companies that provide private insurance, but it's just now they're basically kind of privatizing Medicare.
All right, well, we're going to have to get into that with a policy expert at some point because I have a lot of questions. But for now, stick with us. We'll be right back. We're going to get into the Vitreoretinal View.
This episode of RetinUp is powered by Alcon. With an industry-leading breadth of surgical products and solutions in eye care, Alcon is uniquely positioned to meet the diverse and evolving needs of patients and surgeons around the world. Learn more about Alcon's latest innovation, Unity VCS, at unityvcs.com.
All right, John, we were talking offline before this episode about heads-up 3D surgery and how it's been around for a little while and it maybe has not taken off quite as people expected. Talk to me about the advent of heads-up 3D displays and where we are now.
Yeah, Scott, it's been one of these very futuristic things that's been around for about a decade. Where when it first came out, the predecessor of the Alcon system, which was kind of the first heads-up 3D system, was a system called TrueVision out of California. Startup did an amazing job developing this small camera that you could replace the oculars on your microscope. So you didn't need a new microscope. You just took your microscope. These microscopes can be taken apart. You can take parts off of them, like the oculars can come off. So you can put inverters and filters and whatnot. But the advantage is you could take the oculars off, put a 3D camera in place of the oculars. That 3D camera would run into a computer that then would basically translate that image onto a 50-inch or 40-plus inch monitor that you would then wear 3D glasses and watch and operate with. Alcon acquired TrueVision about a decade ago. We were one of the first places actually to try the TrueVision Alcon Ingenuity system. I fell in love with it because it was so amazing, the quality of the video, the ability to get unbelievably good surgical videos, and the ability to actually watch fellows operate and see them operating the same way I would see myself operating. So you could really have great ability to coach the fellows and know that they were doing the right thing, they were doing it the right way, and it was safe for patients. It's one of those tricky things when you're training fellows is making sure that you're able to train
Right.
them in real time, but not put patients at risk. And I felt like for the first time, this was a system that allowed me to see and be right there next to the fellow and let them do more, and learn better and at a higher acuity level with no compromise in safety for the patients. So that was a great system. It was an affordable system for us. We very quickly adopted it. It's one of the few things that I told our OR, if I have to buy this with my own money, I'm willing to do it because
Jeez. Okay.
it's that big of a game changer, and it was. I was willing to do that. Fortunately, they bought the system for me,
Good. Yeah.
but it was wonderful. It's amazing, and I still use it on every single case now 10 years later. But what's been so surprising is not everybody has had that same advantage that I've had, and not everybody's adopted. In fact, it's probably in less than 5% of the ORs nationwide. And Alcon's not alone. Zeiss has tried to develop a heads-up 3D system. This is one that actually has the ability to use oculars if you want to use oculars. Heidelberg has developed a 3D heads-up system with integrated OCT. Zeiss has an integrated OCT. But they've just really failed to launch as far as widespread adoption.
Why is that? Is the cost a barrier? Is it that the technology is really neat, but maybe not making a difference? Is it some other factor that I'm just overlooking here?
Cost is a big issue. Although I'll tell you, with the Ingenuity system, it's not a crazy expensive system. I mean, you can get into the Ingenuity system used for around $50,000. So it's not something that's going to break the bank, and you don't have to buy a new microscope. So if you like your microscope, we operate with a 40-year-old Leica microscope that has great optics, and I'm glad we
I
did.
see. Okay, so it's brand agnostic. You don't need to have an Alcon scope to have the Alcon visualization.
You can put it on any microscope, which is great because you're not then getting rid of a microscope that still has a lot of utility. And microscope, Scotts, are one of these things that has a 30-year or 40-year lifespan. So if you've got a good microscope and it works for you, you're not going to go in and replace that microscope every 10 years like you might with your vitreoretinal equipment or with a laser that has a certain lifespan or life period. These things can last the entire career of a retina specialist. The second thing, and you mentioned it, is cost. So the Alcon system's cheap because you're not building a microscope around it, at least not yet. For Zeiss and Heidelberg, it pretty much requires a whole new microscope, and those are not microscope agnostic. You have to have those certain microscopes that it's built into, and you're really talking at $200,000 to $300,000, which in a day and age when most of our cases have moved to surgery centers, the reimbursement at surgery centers is going down, is a big ask.
What's the tipping point for a surgeon who's considering this, kicking the tires? Is there a particular opportunity period that they might take advantage of? Like you said, scopes last a long time. Maybe is it once the scope finally kicks the bucket? Is it when they change practices? Like, what's the best time to consider a new visualization system?
I'm afraid too many times the best time to consider it is when the anterior segment person wants one. Many of these surgery centers, especially now with premium IOLs, they've become incredibly profitable on the cataract side of things. So whenever you're doing a premium IOL, you're charging extra money. And there are some things built in, ways that you can measure astigmatism in real time for IOL placement and whatnot that can really make these systems incredibly appealing for the cataract surgeon. And so while the retina surgeons' reimbursements for, the surgery centers are declining, the cataract surgeons' profitability is going up. They're doing more profitable cases. They're garnering more money for the surgery center. And when they say, hey, I want this scope, as a retina specialist, you kind of want to poke your head in there and say, can we get the retinal attachment for it so that I can use it too? And that's how you end up getting one of these.
All right, fascinating stuff. Audience, this was our Vitreoretinal View segment. Stick with us. When we come back from break, we're going to speak with Darius Moshfeghi about his role as a safety monitor in the SOL-1 study. Welcome back. We're here with Darius Moshfeghi. He's chief of the Retina Division and professor at the Stanford University School of Medicine. Dr. Moshfeghi, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Scott and John. It's a real pleasure to be here today.
Darius, welcome to RetinUp. We really wanted to focus on really the first superiority study that we've seen in retina, in ophthalmology, maybe, the SOL-1 study, which phase 3 study showed that tyrosine kinase inhibitors had superiority over aflibercept. We can talk a little bit about the details of the study, but Darius, talk to us about your role within the SOL-1 and the SOL-R studies.
So it was really a fun role, actually, and kind of a unique role initially designed for this study. I was an independent rescue monitor, and I got contacted by the company initially, and it's because of the study design. And as you know, they had a SPA agreement with the FDA, And they had to stick with that in order to meet the requirements of the, pre-agreed upon the way the study would be elaborated, if you will. And one of those was that they were going to have rescue criteria for either vision-threatening hemorrhage or for 15 letters of visual acuity loss, which is different than how we've historically run trials. And so the vision-threatening hemorrhage component was going to be adjudicated at a site level, but they were going to have to contact the rescue monitors every time this happened. The people who were making this adjudication would be the principal investigators. Now, vision-threatening hemorrhage is kind of nebulous, right? Different people will think different things, and it turns out a lot of sites thought any hemorrhage anywhere in the eye was vision-threatening. And if you're the sponsor, you don't want that to happen. And you may say, hey, vision-threatening hemorrhage is only 10 millimeters thick. But if you're the principal investigator at your site, you don't want that to happen because your patient may lose vision. And then everybody says, let's wait for the Duke Reading Center to be the ultimate adjudicator. But the problem there is they're running a ton of trials, and your patient may sit in your office for hours. And so the way they did this was they brought us in. And our job was to have a conversation with the site. So your patient came in, they have this new hemorrhage, they're symptomatic, they're having visual acuity loss. Tell me about the hemorrhage and why you think that we should go in there and treat it. And that's how the conversation went about. We were not incentivized. The independent rescue component of this was that, sure, we're getting paid by the company, but we don't have skin in the game. We have no stocks, no equity. And so our job is to just go and say, if this were a patient in my clinic, how would I treat this? Would I agree with this person? At the end of the day, and I had sites with, conversations with numerous different sites. They would call us. We would draw the images in. We were masked. So if it was visible that there was, the long-term depot drug was visible, they would, have it always such that we couldn't see that. And then we would have this conversation where based on the data, we would say, hey, this is what you're thinking and here's our thoughts on it. And if we overlap, then that was the end of the conversation. We either agreed with them or we would say, hey, you want to come back in a week or 2 weeks or whatever. The important thing here is this. We were strictly advisory. The site could make the call.
And Darius, you said that this was unique to the SPA arrangement that the company had with the FDA. So it does seem like this rescue protocol is unique. Is this the first time that you have an experience that you've observed something like this in ophthalmology?
I don't think it was a mandatory component of the SPA. It was a subsequence of the SPA being in place and how to get around this kind of very nebulous, this kind of finding of vision-threatening hemorrhage, right? Everyone can agree on 15 letters. You bring them in, you do your ETDRS letter chart, and that happens before the masked investigator and the unmasked investigator are available and looking at the data. That's been done by your technician, okay? But now they look in the back at either examination, photograph, OCT, and there's this new finding, and it's a hemorrhage. Is it submacular? Is it large? Is it, brand new? Is it symptomatic? There's all these different components. Is it intraretinal? Is it preretinal? What actually constitutes a vision-threatening hemorrhage? And the FDA had not stipulated that. So it was this wide area of what was going on. It turns out, for me, I would have also had them do it for the visual acuity. Why? Okay.
Yeah.
And
Why?
the reason why is sometimes a patient in the morning has 15 letters of vision loss and they don't have any change on anatomic findings. Okay. They're tired. They're confused. Their eye is dry. They're in a bad mood. Okay. And it's not even necessarily 15 letters that day. It finally gets to 15 letters, And so at that point, that's the trigger. Because the way this trial worked, you had a run-in period of 2 injections. You showed that you either could get to 20/20 or you had gained 10 letters of visual acuity and you had dehydrated the retina. You needed both of those prior to getting randomized on the third visit. On the third visit, you then at that point either received the Eylea or the Axpaxli dose, and then you were followed for every month out to 36 weeks and then out to 52 weeks. And the treatment interventions could occur on those monthly visits or if you presented in between. There was a lot of opportunity for you to accrue up to 15 letters of visual acuity loss.
And Darius, you've been involved in data and safety monitoring, as well as this rescue monitor. Rescue monitor, first time they've ever done this. How did those roles differ? And also, as you talk to these doctors, did you find that a lot of retina specialists kind of really fall in line with similar principles and treat subretinal hemorrhage the same way? Or were you going, wow, we are all over the board with how we treat these patients who have hemorrhage?
There's a lot of questions there, John. So first off, I got my kind of feet wet, if you will, on data safety monitoring back when the brolucizumab product was owned by Alcon, and I joined the RTH, I think it was 250 data safety monitoring protocol, and that was run by some people who had a ton of experience in data safety monitoring. And, it went along, it got picked up by Novartis, and we got through Hawk and Harrier. And at that point, we started seeing some data that was indicative that maybe we were having a problem with the product from a safety perspective. And at that point, the program was robust, right? They had gone into phase 3. They were doing diabetic macular edema, retinal vein occlusions. At one point, I was on 11 data safety monitoring committees just for that one product. And then the safety review committee came out and all of those different things. Subsequently, I ended up being involved in multiple different protocols because of the huge effort that went into, evaluating that. And now we're more aware as a community as to certain types of safety that we should be looking for, either with small molecules or biologics. Mm-hmm. And that's neither here nor there. But what I loved about that, John, was, as you know, I do pediatric retina and I run telemedicine grading center. And this is all about looking at data and correlating it to what's going on. Okay. And you have objective data on the one hand, and then you have outcomes on the other hand. And for me, it was a natural fit. And I felt like I was really contributing by being part of the process and looking at this. So for me, when they said, on top of which, and I tend to be a social person, now you have this opportunity to, instead of like opining in the background, you actually get to work in between the company and the sites. That was, for me, I signed up. And then they gave me the opportunity to work with Barry Cooperman, whom I adore and who can teach.
Barry is great. He's
maybe
great.
The only person on earth who speaks more than me.
Yeah, very true. Very true.
And so what happens is I have viewed the experience like this. These sites are very experienced clinical trialists.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. They are set up. It's not like 2005 where you're coming off a period where it was NIH, NEI funded studies. And we were just getting into pharma-backed studies. All the studies were historically done at major academic medical centers. Today, this is all driven by pharma and it's all run through private practices with some academic sites included, okay? But academicians are generally being hoovered into this other role. Either they're on the advisory committee or steering committees, or they're in monitoring roles like what's just happened here. And these sites are very well run, well thought out. They're great at clinical trials. They do not like the concept of having to check in. And so that was a very diplomatic role, which is kind of shocking because the two of us are not really considered diplomats, right? Dr. Cooperman and myself. And so in the beginning, it was kind of tricky. And some of the sites never really openly embraced it, but it was a small minority, okay? Almost, I would say the overwhelming majority of sites, 98 to 99%, after the first call and how we took the approach, which was, tell us how you think about it. What's going on here? Why do you want to treat this patient? And once we didn't come in hot saying, no, this is crazy, you know, then it became a very collaborative thing. And it'd be just like, yeah, no, we understand. We agree with you. Treat that. Yeah, no problem. Yeah, just let us know when you do it. And then other times it'd be like, can this patient come back? Well, they come from far away. There's a high risk to follow up, loss, and all of that. And, we really want to be good players with the protocol. So all of those kind of things go into how you think about whether this is vision threatening or not. But it was kind of fun.
It sounds like you were like a professional sounding board, not an umpire calling balls and strikes.
I really like that thought. There was a large underlying component where you're this kind of umpire, but at the end of the day, you're also trying to let them come to the decision, on their own accord. And sometimes you are trying to push them in the direction of your thought process, but other times, they knock you off of your game, and you're like, oh, this is very interesting what you're bringing up.
So I'd like to zoom out a little bit. I feel like we've talked around the data, but we didn't actually say what the findings from SOL-1 were. So Darius, talk us through the structure of the study. As John mentioned, this was a superiority study. There was something, different about this one than we see with a lot of non-inferiority studies. And you mentioned this sort of lead-up period, weeks -8, -4, leading to randomization at week 0. So just give us a 10,000-foot view of the study at its structure and what the major findings were.
Yeah. So, I'm going to talk in broad generalities with respect
Please.
to the outcomes because I don't have, the exact second percentage number available. But basically, the superiority outcome here is with respect to maintenance of visual acuity. And this is an agreed upon outcome with the FDA, which was maintenance of vision. And they define maintenance of vision as less than 15 letters lost. Okay. Now, we as a community are not used to doing that. Most physicians treat at any moment for a patient that's in their clinic for disease activity. And disease activity has been, either SREM or intraretinal fluid, subretinal fluid, or visual acuity loss, or some combination of those features. But here they had negotiated in advance that if we can get to this 52-week outcome, looking at 36 weeks of maintenance of visual acuity following a single dose, at randomization, they would give them a superiority outcome. And they had a pre-specified statistical analysis plan that was elaborated from that, which was the tyrosine kinase inhibitor. So at the end of the day, at the 36 weeks, which was the primary outcome, they showed a 17.5% advantage in favor of Axpaxli versus aflibercept, 2 milligrams. Now, this was for maintenance of visual acuity, okay? And this was remarkable because you'd beaten in a superiority outcome aflibercept, which has long been since 2011, it had rapidly gained adoption. And since 2015, it's been far and away the market dominant medication on the market. And people have been comparing against aflibercept in non-inferiority fashions in most of the other clinical trials. The important thing here is the outcome was at 36 weeks. From 6 months, 36 weeks, and out to 52 weeks, they showed 80%, 77%, and about 65% of patients were making it out from 6 months, 9 months, and 12 months. And if you look at the other second-generation anti-VEGF molecules out there, whether that's the Vabysmo molecule or the Eylea HD or aflibercept 8 milligram molecule, they're approved out to 16 weeks. This is double that, okay? And you're getting about 3/4 to 80% are making either 9 months or 6 months and lasting out to 52 weeks. This is pretty amazing.
Darius, I think a lot of retina specialists struggle to understand the SOL-1 study, or at least to put it into context
Yeah.
with how they're treating patients in clinic, because we don't treat patients with 2 or 3 injections of aflibercept and then kind of let them ride like they did in the control group. What would you say to the person that says, "How do I make sense of this, and how do I kind of start to think about how it's gonna be used clinically?"
So it's interesting that you bring this up because none of the retina specialists are also not following the study protocols. The one thing you can say about retina specialists is that as soon as a drug is approved, they disregard the study completely. And they
Yep.
all try to morph this drug into their own version of a treat and extend protocol, which is exactly the opposite of what happened in the trial. Okay. And early on, and maybe it's because of my history as an ocular oncologist, I have been a very strict adherent to, mandated treatment intervals, okay, continuous dosing. And so when you look at what people are saying, they're saying, well, I'm going to treat for any fluid or for any change in visual acuity or any threat or any shram, okay? And so the maximum threat would be you're treating monthly, right? If you found something every month. And when we presented this data at the Macula Society, I wasn't the one presenting it, but they had a panel up there for the company. One of the more interesting presentations was by Adnan Tufal, okay? And he got up there and he said, hey, if you take patients who have really good vision, greater than 75 letters, and you look at them and you give them monthly dosing, and he was looking at data from, I believe, it was the Marina trial, okay? So patients who were at 75 letters, and they got 12 monthly injections. Those patients, from peak vision till the end of 12 months, gave up 4.5 letters. So if you gave them 12 injections and they hit their peak at the end of 12 months, they lost 4.5 letters, okay? So here, what you see in this study is right around 4.5, 5 letters at 52 weeks with one injection, okay? And it's hard to compare across studies, but that's what the delta would have been. Possibly you could have done 11 more injections, and historically, you still would have ended up with the same result.
That does give it good relevance because we all kind of in our mind know what 12 monthly injections of ranibizumab is going to do. And it's kind of the gold standard. I mean, really, if you're talking about maintaining vision.
Yeah. And when I brought up the ocular oncology reference, it's this. If you have retinal blastoma and I give you 2 out of a planned 6 cycles of chemotherapy and your tumor completely disappears, nobody is not going to give you the remaining 4 cycles of chemotherapy, okay? And so for me, I was just like, if Marina and Anchor showed that you got 12 monthly trials for ranibizumab, and then if you go back to View 1, View 2, and you were getting, in year 2, 6 injections of aflibercept, I was going to give you Q8 dosing. Why not? That's the best visual acuity that was on the table and available to the patients. I'm not here to treat. My patient has never asked me, doctor, how come you're not treating me because I have fluid if their vision was good, okay? And when their vision is good, they're still like, well, I don't care if I have fluid, keep injecting, okay? And so if they're there, they want to get their treatment. They just do.
Yeah. Darius, there were floaters, a lot of floaters reported in the SOL-1 study. First thing is were these floaters that the doctors identified, or were these floaters reported by the patients, and what were the floaters?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And when did the floaters occur, right? Okay. And so the floaters were identified by the physicians. There is no MEDRA, which is kind of like the language of adverse events. So when you're looking in, there's specific terminology that you have to use to describe things. And if you see something in the eye and the closest you can get is floater, then it's a floater, okay? And in this case, what they were looking at was the drug depot, the drug itself, the TKI, was slowly dissolving, the hydrogel, okay? And so as that hydrogel breaks up, it gets these multiple little particles. And this typically was happening around 24 to 36 weeks. And so when the principal investigators, both the unmasked ones were looking inside the eye, they saw this and then they said, oh, floaters, okay? Moving ahead, as a consequence, actually, of this trial, they actually have a new MEDRA term for drug particle breakup over time. And so, and then the next thing is that 24 to 36 weeks is when these particles were noted as it was breaking up. And that's part of the process. It was designed to last between 36 and 52 weeks, and it was inducing no harm. And then finally, when we look at, like in Marina and Anchor, for ranibizumab, floaters were very common. They were noted up to 19% of the time. And so floaters are something that we affiliate a lot. In this case, they're not affiliated with inflammation or vision loss or anything adverse. It's just part of the process of the hydrogel dissolving.
You know, Darius, I know that your role as an independent rescue monitor in the SOL-1 study doesn't give you insight into the company's strategy, but we talked a little bit about how this is a superiority study, and it got us thinking, what is the advantage to a superiority study over a non-inferiority trial? Because it feels like it's a higher bar, and there's the potential to still perform very well but not reach superiority and therefore fail the trial. So one, I'm curious, what your thoughts are on superiority versus non-inferiority. And then two, what you think your colleagues will think about a superiority study versus a non-inferiority study. Will that carry as much weight or more weight, or will they just kind of disregard it and they say an approved drug is an approved drug and we'll figure it out later?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I can't claim to know exactly what my colleagues are thinking, or even better, what they're going to do with what they're thinking. But from the most immediate benefit from a superiority outcome, if in fact this drug goes on and gets regulatory approval from the FDA, is that it'll allow them in an ideal situation to get superiority in the label, which will allow them to avoid step therapy. And I'm going to leave John to speak about that because I don't run across that a lot in my practice in an academic center, although some academic centers do, but basically allows you to avoid trying either a biosimilar or a medication that's less powerful, if you will, before it gets approved, okay? The second part of your question, it really comes down to when physicians, how do they view the superiority outcome? I think that's going to be something that they're going to figure out on their own over time. I think initially that people were expecting greater visual acuity delta between aflibercept and Axpaxli. And I think that they're still processing what that means. And as a continuous doser with, the all-time champion, aflibercept, I knew it was a great drug. I told them up front, I was like, in 6 months, I personally have never seen a patient who's been loaded with aflibercept lose 15 letters of visual acuity from fluid alone. I've seen them get lost, develop a hemorrhage. I've seen them develop a retinal pigment epithelial tear. Sometimes they have inflammation or some other event. But from fluid within a 6-month period, if you've received 3 loading doses, I've never seen it, okay? Which means you can go a long time. So I, for one, wasn't surprised. I was surprised that they made it out to 9 months with the delta not being that different, okay? But at 24 weeks, no, I was not surprised by that. And so physicians currently who aren't continuous dosers in their whole career have been doing treat and extend, I think that it's the show me state, okay? They're going to have to go out there and see it from themselves. And they're going to do kind of like what I initially proposed they're going to do. They're going to slip this into their protocol. And they've got, someone who's coming in every 10 weeks, okay? And they're going to go and give it, whatever they're getting at 10 weeks, let's say Vabysmo. And then they're going to say, come back in a week. And then they're going to give them the Axpaxli. They're going to bring him back at 10 weeks. They're going to look, there's going to be a little bit of fluid there or maybe not, okay? If there's a little bit of fluid there, they're going to hit him with the Vabysmo again. They're going to bring him back in 10 weeks. And at that point, there may be a separation. And then they're going to say, oh, well, maybe because they're treating extenders and there's no vision loss, there's no hemorrhage, now there's no fluid, they may send him out. And then they may send him out again. And then at that point, and that ramp up period is a one-off, okay? You never have to do it again. Because I don't see people historically probably sending people out for every 9 months, but I see them sending them out for every 6 months, okay? And looking at them twice a year. And particularly for your treatment naive patients, load them up, give them 3 doses. On the 1 week after the 3rd dose, hit them with an Axpaxli or hit them with an Axpaxli at time 0, okay? And then basically lock in the effects of your monotherapy VEGF. And then you bring them back at 12 weeks and they're like, they don't have anything. You bring them back at 16 weeks, they don't have anything. 20 weeks, you're beginning to kind of maybe believe that the drug is working. 24 weeks, you're absolutely believing the drug's working, and then you treat them again. But now you don't have to ramp again. You're just locking it in.
Darius, there's a second phase 3 study that's underway, the SOL-R study.
Yeah.
Very different than the SOL-1 study, design and everything. What can we draw from the SOL-1 study that can help inform us about what we might expect to see in SOL-R?
Yeah. So that study was designed to remove basically variability. If you got rid of the fluid variability and you locked in your visual acuity, so you had to get dehydrated and demonstrate that you could hold your fluid before you could get randomized. And so you had a series of injections. I think it was up to 5 injections prior to randomization. When you look at patients who were in this trial who met that criteria, about 3/4 of those patients would have made it to 6 months. Okay, so I am very encouraged, particularly in a non-inferiority outcome, that they can stay within the boundaries of that non-inferiority margin. Trials are hard to predict, John, okay?
Yeah.
And it's always hard to use retrospective data. Right now, this was prospective data, but we're looking at a subset of that patients and saying, how would these patients have performed under that study? It looks like the majority of those patients would have done very well, okay? Particularly at the outcome at 6 months.
Scott, just for the audience's sake, the SOL-R study is, like Darius said, much more traditional. First of all, it's not a superiority study. It's non-inferiority. There's 3 groups. There's your traditional aflibercept run-in, and then every other month. There's, like Darius said, up to 5 injections of aflibercept. Then you get Axpaxli, and you're followed. And then you actually have a really interesting group, which involves 8 milligrams of aflibercept and just open-ended. So that's going to tell us, I think, as much about 8 milligrams of aflibercept and its durability as everything else. But really a very complementary design to the SOL-1, really looking at different patient types.
Yeah, and to John's point, the SOL-R was more along the lines of a principal investigator are normally used to dealing with. We would get a call where a patient would have 5 letters of visual loss, and then the automated measurement of the central subfield thickness would indicate that there were 80 or 85 microns. And then we would draw our team together, and it's important to talk about our team. We would have the medical monitor and we'd have our 2 rescue monitors, and we would all sit around. The medical monitor would bring in the images, and then Barry and I would actually look slice by slice and actually measure. And you had to hit that 75 microns, which is not something we do in clinic, right? Mm-hmm. It's close, looks like 75 microns, but here it's a clinical trial. And there's a lot of, depending on closely you're adhering to, the trial protocol. And so you want, for the sponsor site, you actually want to make sure that every rescue is a real rescue. And so that was kind of a lot of fun. And I think that the sites had a lot more interest in this trial because of how it would more closely resembled their clinical practice.
Darius Moshfeghi is the chief of the Retina Division and a professor at the Stanford University School of Medicine. Darius, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, guys.
RetinUp is an editorially independent podcast supported with advertising. Laura Brown is our production and marketing lead, and Liz Hogan is the head of business development. If you're interested in advertising on RetinUp, have a question for the mailbag, or just have a topic you'd like us to cover, send an email to info@retinup.com. Follow us on LinkedIn and visit retinup.com to sign up for our newsletter so you never miss an episode. Like and subscribe to the show whether you're on YouTube or a podcast streamer. Leave us a review if you're feeling generous. And if you like the show or if you found this episode useful, pass it along to a colleague. That really helps us expand our audience. We'll be back next time with a fresh perspective on what's happening in retina.